Hello everyone, my name is Pujita Guha and I am currently a PhD student in Cinema Studies, School of Arts and Aesthetics, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. I have also been a visiting faculty teaching new media at Delhi University to undergraduate students. Today, I am going to be talking about contemporary cinema of Japan from the 80s and 90s. The introductory part of this module will give students a lowdown of what is considered a lost decade, that is the 80s and the early 90s, and will give analysis of historiographic and critical lapses of this period. Second, this module will introduce students to what was the alternative cinema of this period and also briefly speak about Japanese or J-horror. Third, this module will give a critical analysis of Takeshi Kitano's films. Fourth, it will conclude by a short note on youth cinema of this period. Thank you. So let's begin. Introduction. In Search of the Lost Decade. The Fall Guy 1982 opens with a washed up actor demanding that a crucial staircase fight scene be enacted. A scene that if shot will give him considerable mileage over his competitive co-star. The only hurdle is that the scene demands someone roll and fall off a 3-story high staircase without harnesses or safety nets. This discussion finds itself being held in the very same staircase under construction. The director is perched on top of the staircase with the actor in the middle pleading alternately between the director and the actor's lackeys standing at the bottom of the staircase. Figure 1. A metaphorical miniature of Japan's own studio system, the director nevertheless finds himself in a quandary. Neither the sturdy stuntmen of Tokyo take the precarious job, nor does the general political milieu of the 80s allow for such grandiose action scenes, the director argues. Japan is poised for peace after a decade-long political struggle, and the gore of violence makes no sense. The peaceful 80s are also an era of the growth of video and early digital cultures, anime and media mixing, threatening cinemas and consequently the studio's dominant position in public culture. As Fall Guy starkly reminds us, cinema's need to resuscitate its own position comes through the sacrifices done by petty labourers, who with their life-threatening stunts are expected to restore glory to the medium. Here, one of the lackeys finally steps up to do the job in order to pay off his debts to the washed-up star. This commentary on the state of Japanese cinema repeats a familiar narrative about its post-war heyday and its fall from grace in the 80s. The 80s and 90s were a time of churning in the Japanese film industry. It was the cusp between the end of the studio era and a new media wave of independent film productions that were increasingly aimed at foreign festivals and markets. During the 80s, Japan also fell under the throes of economic depression and stasis, a rethinking of post-war culture, the rise of nationalism, just as it pursued reforms to make itself more globally competitive. Alexander Zahalten details how then contemporary Japanese papers juxtaposed the highest cinema-going figures from the 1950s with contemporary data 1127452000 in 1958 to 11957500 in 1996, compared the number of active film theatres which peaked in 1960 and concluded that the number of films produced in a given year had reduced by more than half in the same time frame. Critics and film festival programmers agreed that by the late 1970s, cinema was primarily a crash and burn spectacle, marking the end of a century gone by. When Tadao Sato in 1982 wrote a monograph for the 70th anniversary of Nikkatsu, Japan's oldest major film studio, he compressed the decade following 1972 in a few lines titled "The Period from Action Film Onward." With this, he virtually erased everything Nikkatsu produced after the new wave, especially its sexually explicit pink films. Sato's book came out at a time when Nikkatsu was still releasing almost 70 films a year, a lion's share of a total of around 330 Japanese films annually produced. Sato's refusal to discuss the pink films provided a historiographic gap for that period, especially for the years that saw close to 75% of films from Japan falling within the pink film bracket. In addition to the systematic discursive elisions that critics created in treating the 80s, the period also saw technological shifts, most notably with the arrival of video that announced the cinema's presumed death in public culture. In July 1983, the film producer Haruki Kadokawa released a double bill of films that became extremely popular. Detective Story, directed by Negishi Kichitaro, and The Little Girl Who Conquered Time, directed Obayashi Nobuhiko, Figure 2. However, departing from usual hierarchy of releases, first on big screen and only later on video cassettes, Kadokawa released the film simultaneously in theatres and on VHS and Betamax 2 tapes. While an unusual move then, given industry norms, Kadokawa's move signaled how cinema's place in history and media hierarchy had come and done, with video surge signaling the slow demise of the grand cinema we knew before. This story of decline, however, has been transformed into a narrative of resurgence in the recent past, with Japanese films increasingly being awarded in festivals abroad and also raking in more money homewards. The industry was also invigorated by the government, who wanted to use popular culture for national branding or bonding, and was thus able to establish new financing methods. Zaltan notes how today film funds and production committees involving several media companies spread the financial risk, and banks develop an interest in investing in this more transparently regulated system. Japanese cinema began to experience a turnaround from 1997 when three films, Fireworks by Kitano Takeshi, The Eel by Imamura Shohei, and Suzaku by Kawase Naomi, won major prizes at the Venice and Cannes Film Festival. Anime and manga cultures were already well accepted abroad, and with these awards, international interest surged, in turn helping to promote the government's Cool Japan campaign. Inside Japan also, film viewership began to rise along with the numbers of films released. In 2006, 417 films from Japan were released, up from 230 in 1991, the lowest figure since the mid-1950s. The number of screens climbed to 30262, up from the 1993 low of 1734, the lowest since 1947. And the total box office gross for domestic films climbed to the third highest level of all time. Cinema in Japan, it seemed, was back on track. Alternative Cinema Japan. Since the collapse of the studio system in the 1980s, nearly all Japanese films are technically independent productions, even if they do wind up being distributed by a major company like Toho or Shochiku. However, unlike their most celebrated Euro-American contemporaries, many of Japan's new wave or indie filmmakers, influenced by manga and anime, have focused on genre filmmaking. Alternative or independent Japanese cinema has offered an enormous variety of styles, from gory extreme cult movies to the thoughtful chamber dramas, with most films clustering around one end of the spectrum or the other. This shift to genre emerged since Japanese filmmakers would make any type of film in order to make a living, moving across genres as their careers progressed, with each phase leaving traces throughout their subsequent body of work. The deep, richly drawn characters in the films of Hirokazu Korida and Naomi Kawase owe much to their early observational work in documentary films. It may seem surprising that the romantic comedy filmmaker Ruichi Hiroki began his career by making pink films, but better reflection shows that his experience left an abiding trace in the manner he depicts the sexuality of his characters in his later works. Another prolific filmmaker, Takashi Miike, moved between straight-to-video cheap productions and big-budget productions, all the while maintaining a readily identifiable pulp horror aesthetic. He came to be identified with horror films like The Gruesome Audition or Sukiyaki Western Django, a Japanese cowboy movie influenced by the spaghetti westerns of the 1970s, and 13 Assassins, a samurai movie that incorporated the director's signature blood-drenched action aesthetic. Following Audition's success, other directors too contributed to the bourgeoising market of Japanese horror on DVD and at film festivals. The first major profitable J-horror film was The Mystery of Rampo, based on Edogawa Rampo's short story, and led to the bourgeoising of J-horror. Ishii Sogo's Angel Dust, a film on the religious convert accidentally programmed as a serial killer, the Ring series or Ringu, and even Shimizu Takashi's The Grudge. With films such as Suicide Club, Love Exposure and Cold Fish, Sion Sono popularized socially conscious horror films, peeling off the apparently docile veneer of Japanese society to stir up a world of extreme violence and fetishistic sex populated by suicidal teens, murderous sociopaths and depraved perverts. Figure 4. While it may appear that these films are made only to thrill and shock, they often throw light on those truths about Japanese society that are not expressed in more polite genres like the romantic melodrama. Even as Sono's films often highlight real social problems, Nishimura's Tokyo Gore Police imagines a dystopian future in which contemporary society's most dangerous realities like surveillance, television, authoritarian police tactics, and genetic experimentations are portrayed in a not so illogical extreme. Moreover, rather than being entirely the byproducts of our sex and violence saturated age, that these films have their roots in traditional horror imagery of Japanese art and literature dating back at least to the tale of Shutendoji, a famous folk tale about a hero fighting a ferocious demon that has been depicted with graphically violent imagery since the Edo era. Figure 6. Traditional Japanese art is as much about demons, ghosts and bloodletting as it is of tea ceremonies and cherry blossoms. Takeshi Kitano. If Japan's alternative cinema moves between peace and violence, television and cinema, then this dualist conundrum is most concretely encapsulated in the life and works of Takeshi Kitano. The title of Kitano's 1998 film Takeshi's emphasizes this duality. The title refers to first the successful film and television star Beat Takeshi, played by Takeshi Kitano, and eponymous to Kitano's TV comedy personality, and a down-and-out actor named Kitano Takeshi, played by the actor-director himself. Figure 7. A story of doubling the other, the narrative finds the lives of the actor and star being increasingly entangled, reaching a point when the washed-out actor desires to kill the star. With Kitano directing the film himself, this doubling takes on a deeper inflection. The doubling in the front of the camera is doubled by another behind it. The film's title screen visualizes this mirroring by first depicting the reflection of the title in blue before revealing the word Takeshi's in red. Figure 8. Kitano, presenting many versions of himself, however, dates back to the time when he began directing through the character names in the groundbreaking skit We're the Clown Tribe or in his published books. As Aaron Guerrero argues, Kitano makes a strategy of offering different versions of himself into the means of negotiating a televisual world. Kitano's regular television work gives him financial security, allowing him to do very different work in cinema or more daring television comedy elsewhere. Kitano says that he swings back and forth between these characters like a pendulum, a metaphor he also uses to describe his cinematic shifts from the romantic to the violent to the comic, that is a scene at the sea, to the violent sonatine to the comic Getting Any. Kitano's films move between intermittent bursts of violence and restfulness, squirting loads of blood and staccato assaults alternating with long stretches of observation and pause. Kitano's quick violence follows when the camera longingly dwells on the still victim, and violence sits at a brooding presence even without these acts of mayhem and bloodshed taking place. Violence, like the Yakuza, exists in the everyday, often tinged with irony and banal humor, rather than in an extraordinary and spectacular space with which the cops and gangsters genre is imagined. Sonatine exemplifies Kitano's filmmaking style, moving between melodrama, the Yakuza genre, mischief and bursts of violence. The film portrays Murakawa, played by Kitano, and his crew, who having become too successful in running their businesses in Tokyo, are perceived as a threat by a more senior Yakuza. To get rid of this threat, the senior sends Murakawa and his crew to Okinawa on an insufficient errand while their temporary headquarters are bombed. Murakawa wanders up and down and ponders by the seaside through much of the film, while his group seeks shelter in a seaside hideout. Sonosine's tranquil pace belies its generic description, as Kitano presents a Yakuza world far removed from the violence and stringent hierarchy with which it has become so synonymous. A violent cop and Hanabi present to us a violent world of cops and Yakuzas, the cops acting as go-between between the audience and the Yakuza. In Sonatine, the audience gains direct access to the world of Yakuza, albeit one that is off-duty and leisurely experiencing the world. At the seaside, the Yakuza's formal suits are replaced by beach shirts of breathing fluid fabric that allows the shirts to sway and fall with the sea wind. Figure 9. When worn by a rather brutish beefed up bodies of the Yakuzas, these loud pieces become jarringly provocative, animating indifference and a menacing playfulness. Playing with social conventions, Kitano's Yakuzas give the lush suits they wear an aloof air, while ironically, the lazy floral rayon shirts paired with loosely tailored trousers exude a quiet confidence. Figure 10. It is this contrast of violence and contemplative softness, heightened through the choice of the character's clothing, that sets up a duality of Kitano's image. Kitano, however, delivers this duality minimally, something that is uncharacteristic of the Yakuza genre. His style speaks of violence and wrath in the calmest manner possible. Sonatine consists of long static shots, often directly facing expansive landscapes. His minimalist intervention, along with the minute gestural acting that gives birth to a solid stillness. Figure 11. The editing consists mostly of single cut frameworks that also contribute to the construction of his austere aesthetics. In his film, there are no jarring cuts, no jump cuts, except a few exceptions, and violent shootouts are often tempered by music or static shots that frame the action at a distance. The films are generally devoid of saturated colors, with little heavy camera movement. The sound and music are mildly orchestral, low, just like the voices of the actors and actresses. The three suicide scenes, the first scene of just Murakawa's play with the empty gun, the second of his nightmare, the third and the real suicide scene, play in a tranquil, bizarrely serene way, appearing poetic and even fabulatory between fact and fiction. Figure 12. In figure 12a, in the first suicide scene, the camera tracks from left to right as the Russian roulette progresses, leaving Murakawa's two assistants confused and the game increasingly sullen with every round. Figure 12b, the same scene which appears in Murakawa's dreams is depicted with tighter close-ups to express the latent fear, the color mildly bleached out even. Figure 12c. In the final scene of the film, when Murakawa finally kills himself, the action and the mood carries over from the previous scene of the climactic shootout, even as Kitano cuts to a close-up and then to a wide frame placing the car against a pastoral background. Murakawa's anger, his despair, pain, his craving for revenge and retaliation leads to an unexpected cinematic catharsis that is done without changing the soothing tempo of shooting and acting. Figure 13. Here we see, in the finale, Kitano sets up a poetic sequence as he intercuts between Kitano's climactic shootout in the hotel room below and his newfound lovers bursting of crackers by the seaside at the top. The entire sequence maintains a uniform tempo, intercutting on gunshots and a synth-based mild rhythmic score. Lastly, all of Kitano's macabre gruesome violence is mitigated by Kitano's choice of landscape. As the narrative moves from Tokyo City, shot in largely indoor spaces, to Okinawa, a smaller town, and further to a remote beach house, Kitano's frames get increasingly wider, his character being placed against the serene seascape. Even bloody shootouts are girdled by long sandy beaches, with calm, dim waves hitting their shorelines and streams of blood trickling through them. Conclusion. Youth films and the other side of the spectrum. The Seishun Eiga, or the Japanese youth films, are attempts to peek into the social and the virtual worlds that adolescents inhabit, while noting the attempts of their elders to understand generational shifts. Japanese cinema has frequently targeted the youth to renew their industry's flagging fortunes, both in the post-war period of the 50s and then in the post-globalization and economic stagnation of the 80s. as a means of tapping into an established audience that is eager for visual stimulus. The roots of Japanese youth film are literary and stem from the works of Shintaro Ishihara. Ishihara published his first novel, Season of the Sun, in 1955, 2 months before graduating from college. An overnight sensation, it put light on the rebellious Taiyozuku youth culture, which emerged in the aftermath of World War II. Certain directors have taken on the challenge of presenting contemporary Japan through the youth films because these films are an advancement of technology and how it creates new spaces for teenagers to not only express themselves but try to find themselves through the exploration of alternative identities. Writer-director Shunji Iwai's All About Lily Chow Chow charts a similar premise where an adolescent boy, a lackey for his best friend, the class bully in school, seeks refuge in internet chat forums dedicated to the singer of his desire, Lily Chow Chow. Iwai's project came off internet chat forums where he went live with his internet novel in the form of a website called Lilyholic, where he posted messages as several characters on the message board. Figure 15. Readers of the novel were free to post on the board alongside Iwai's character and interact with each other. And it was this message board from where some of the content from the movie came. But despite the intoxicating allure of Lily Chow Chow's music and the appeal of online communities, the internet provided only a temporary escape or refuge from the problems facing the characters in the real world. The permanent escapes were far bleaker. Suicide, self-sacrifice and murder were the options offered by the director, who seemed to come to the conclusion that the virtual worlds are ultimately misleading. Figure 16. Assessing the Japanese youth cinema of today, one also notices the intensification of juvenile delinquency and teen-oriented violence in these movies, from the petty scams to the calculated organization of All About Lily Chow Chow and Crow's Zero, Takeshi Miike's 2000 film on school bullies epitomizing a Yakuza clan. However, the notion of freedom emerges as perhaps the most crucial concern within the Japanese youth cinema of this era. The institutional framework of Crow's Zero shows an adolescent outlook of the overarching system, represented by Suzuran High School. Instead of trying to find a virtual escape from it, as in All About Lily Chow Chow, the teenagers of Crow's Zero try to wrestle control of the system in order to find some form of freedom within the confines of social restraint, and to thereby acknowledge their role in the future of an ever-changing, ever-growing Japanese society. That's all. Thank you.